Hello and welcome back to Radio Rothbard. This is Ryan McMakin. I'm a senior editor at the Mises Institute, and with me is my associate editor, Tho Bishop. And we're here to talk about populism. And specifically, why did Murray Rothbard support populism? As he fairly clearly did in several of his essays, especially those about the late 19th century and the progressive era. So we'll look a little bit about that, and is there some value then to encouraging more democratic participation from the public, which is essentially what populism is, and this idea that the voting public can be a check on the power of the state. So welcome, Tho.
Glad to be back with you, Ryan.
The election is almost upon us, and we've been talking about democracy-type stuff for past couple of weeks, and we're going to talk about it at least one more time. I think maybe next Wednesday we could just talk about the election after, if we even know who won it.
Might be recording from a bunker as the Civil War is playing out in real time all around us, but shall see how it goes.
Yes, I'm thankful I don't live in some big northeastern city or anything like that. And but in the lead up, let's talk about, well, is it a good thing to encourage people to vote? Should we just assume, as it seems to be the media's assumption, that the more people vote, the more you move in the direction of social democracy and more welfare and more of the agenda that the modern Democratic Party wants? That may or may not be actually empirically true, but let's look at it a little bit. But first, the issue is the theory behind it. And as you know, at the Mises Institute, we hear a lot from readers who take the anti-majoritarian view on this. And this goes back to Madison, this whole idea that we need to control the majority and that countries self-destruct when there's too much majority participation in the political process. And Madison had this whole idea that if you had a large republic with a lot of different regions and states and groups of people, that these groups would cancel each other out and that this would act as a check upon majoritarian power. And so his primary concern was to control the power of majorities. And a lot of this is in Federalist number 10, which I've had to read many times because it's a foundational text in any introductory political science class, which I taught for 8 or 9 years. And he just talks about that in detail and in other places where, well, our real problem is in making sure that the public with its licentiousness doesn't take over the political system. But was that theory right? Interestingly, in his new book on secession, F.H. Buckley has a little section on that, and he talks about how, well, in the 18th century, sure, Madison was probably right. Madison had this idea that you couldn't, at the national level, create any really unified, large interest groups. It was too hard to mobilize in the 18th century. The communication didn't allow for it. But Buckley suggests that in the modern era, technology does allow for interest groups to come together and essentially take over the political system. And so Buckley compares this to the views of Jefferson and George Mason and Roger Sherman, who took more of a decentralized view and thought the states should really dominate the political system, and that the real danger wasn't in too much democratic participation offering at the local level some sort of takeover and diminishment of minority rights. He thought that the real problem was that this big federal government that Madison wanted would actually concentrate power and ultimately allow for large, untouchable interest groups to actually take over. So they were more concerned with what Buckley calls minoritarian misbehavior, this idea that the real threat came from small, powerful minorities that could end up manipulating the political system to their benefit. And Buckley makes the case that I think that Mason was right, that Jefferson was right, that if we look around us, we see that the real problem isn't that at the state or local level that majorities are all trampling the rights of the minorities. It seems that really what's destabilizing the U.S. and causing serious problems and causing us to go bankrupt and so on are these small groups of different interests that have outsized power at the federal government, and that it's really the reverse of what Madison said, that it's not this majority induced licentiousness, which is just a word they keep using, that we all just became lazy and we're all just voting and handing power to ourselves through the federal government. No, it's much more organized than that. It's certain groups that are really exercising power. But how does that manifest itself in the modern world today, though?
I remember working with the House Financial Services Committee, Barney Frank, actually, who I learned a lot from. He was wrong on just about every single issue, but he was just his mannerisms and the way they could control a room was always very interesting. And one of the things that he pointed out is that when we think about who controls Congress, or some of the most powerful interest groups. The first thing that comes to mind is kind of like shady bankers and Wall Street and all sort of stuff, and they certainly tend to work out and have all sorts of they very rarely lose a legislative battle. But one of the most powerful groups is real estate agents and people in the housing market, and you have because every single congressional district has members of you have real estate PACs, you have lenders, community lenders, and things like that all have a vested interest in there. They're able to speak to their congressman directly. That industry is a very small industry relative to the rest of the American economy, but it's a very powerful one. And you see, the amount of policies that were baked into, that's one of the big issues leading into 2008. There was such a major bias towards the home buyers that it created helped fuel these policies that led to the housing bubble, and many of these still exist today. And so again, that's one way of a very powerful, small, focused interest group can have tremendous amount of power. I mean, we see that. I think foreign policy is a major thing as well. I mean, war is typically unpopular. Outside of 9/11, you had that big rush of patriotic fervor, and you could pretty much have gone to war with anyone at that point. But over time, right? The Afghanistan war, Iraq war have been unpopular for a very, very long time. We're still there, and one of the most effective lobbying outfits in Washington D.C. are various weapons manufacturers. It's always Daniel McAdams, the Ron Paul Institute. He makes this point all the time, and it's a great one. Again, if you look at who's funding a lot of these serious military think tanks on foreign policy, I mean it's people who build the bombs, and so they're very happy when things go boom. And then you have in terms of interest groups that have a lot of power in focusing on where these things go. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of Americans, major funders of both parties are very interested in the protection of Israel. So that's always a topic that that shaped American foreign policy for several decades. So again, all these things is you see very clearly play out that. And now, of course, another one where you look at the way the electoral map plays out. Iowa farmers and ethanol. The advantage of having the first primary. Nobody wants to tick off Iowa if you have any sort of presidential ambitions. It's a very strong built-in thing there. And so the interest of these small minority groups are able to dictate policy for the federal government in ways that have profound ramifications for day-to-day lives, in spite of the fact that isolated, these issues are either not driving focuses of American voters, or they're not, or they're explicitly unpopular. This is the case of war.
Right. I think that's an interesting phenomenon that doesn't get explored very often, at least not explicitly, is this fact that so many of the issues that are driving Washington politics, it seems, are not the issues that the voters seem particularly interested in, whether like central banking, right? With the exception of the Ron Paul period, It didn't seem that that anybody ever mentions the central bank or its policies. It's become more high profile lately, but historically, nobody has talked about that except if you go back to the 19th century. And then, of course, foreign policy as well. Polls have been done showing that there is this huge divide between what the public wants in terms of foreign policy and what the public actually gets. And so that would certainly suggest your thesis there, that there's a lot going on that are mostly really just between small interest groups and the people who are running Washington. And that the general voting public seems to be excluded from that.
The power of seeing these lobbyists kind of file in, you have regulars and that they've got their same seat, they've got the routine down, and again, it's not normally the obvious suspects, right? Like it works on so many different levels, and it becomes so baked in. It's because they're able to establish themselves. There's so many of these. The way that they're able to, they build these institutions that help sell their own credibility, right? And so, you have this trickle down of certain special interest groups build up certain research centers. The research centers support the interest groups. And how dare you question the expert class because they know what they're talking about, and this is another thing is that when you have a bunch, when you have a something like the federal government that has so much authority, so much power, and so much individual decision making on votes, you don't have people qualified to make these decisions, and so they effectively sell off their decision making process to whatever expert or interest group that they've become either emotionally or financially tied to, and that's the way the sausage is made.
So, contrary to this belief among many, especially conservative Americans today, there was never this unity among the founding fathers who all agreed upon what the narrative should be, and that everybody agreed with Madison. Of course, there was immense opposition to the Madisonian narrative, this idea that we need to control democratic participation, and that the real danger lies at the state and local level, and that the federal government will simply cancel out, this large republic will just cancel out all interests at that level. And in fact, this was a long-lasting narrative that was very powerful throughout the 19th century. And this really brings us, I think, to the Rothbard question, is why did Rothbard support populism? And I think if we look at Rothbard's writing in the Progressive era, and also his writing from the various volumes of Conceived in Liberty, we can see fairly clearly that Rothbard didn't agree with the Madison narrative, that he clearly was more on the side of the Jeffersonians, and that he continued to agree with the narrative that proceeded through the 19th century. And this was something that, that was handed down throughout the 19th century through Samuel Tilden, who was the party leader throughout the mid-19th century and won in 1876, or rather the late mid-19th century, and also then through the Cleveland Democrats, but also, of course, through the Jacksonians, who were in power in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. Now, what was this narrative? And we can find this, interestingly, in a book called The Transatlantic Persuasion by Robert Kelly. Now, this is a book I stumbled upon because David Gordon mentions it in a footnote. And otherwise, it's just undiscussed. And it's a book from the 60s, now out of print. But as you read it, and you can see what is this ideological narrative that so many American Democrats, but also liberal, as in classical liberal Brits and Canadians subscribe to also, we find a narrative that starts to look very familiar if we're familiar with Rothbard's thinking on this matter. And basically what how Kelly describes it, and which is also described in an earlier book called The Jacksonian Persuasion, interestingly, is that it goes like this, that the Republic was created and it was a lot of hardworking, independent-minded people in towns and villages and on farms. And however, at the same time, there existed in the cities this financial uber class, if you will, the wealthy, the very powerful, the people who wanted a central bank. And these people have been conspiring for decades to destroy the virtues and the foundations of the American Republic. And he talks about how Samuel Tilden, who became an important theorist on this issue, had learned this basically at his grandpa's knee, that the family, it was a long-standing Democrat family, and that he would hear these stories about how this small number of wealthy people were trying to destroy America and take over the political system, especially at the national level. And so this is how Kelly phrases it, quote, Tilden was told over and over again of the Revolution and the War of 1812, and of the dramatic days of the early Republic when Hamilton and Jefferson had founded the two parties. He absorbed an exciting sense of the immediacy of these controversies. Now, Hamilton was the bad guy in this story, and Jefferson was the good guy. And this went on to really go on to other bad guys who were usually the American Whigs and anyone who opposed American Democratic Party's proposals of small government, laissez-faire, local control, those sorts of things, and also its opposition to the central bank. And this expanded beyond the borders of the U.S. Kelly talks about how Martin Van Buren later, when he was ex-president, he was in England, and he was there when the Chartist movement in England of working class male voters wanted to seize more voting power in England. And Van Buren thought this was a good thing, and the Democrats in America cheered this. So there was a camaraderie, what Kelly calls a cousinship, between the American Democrats and the radicals and the Peelites in England. The radicals including people like John Bright and Richard Cobden, who were basically the hardcore laissez-faire liberals of the 19th century. So this is an identifiable movement that Rothbard was well aware of and could see the benefit of. And what he saw was a connection here between the expansion of the vote in England and the U.S. and a greater devotion to laissez-faire, greater opposition to central banking. It was opposition to a high tariff in a lot of cases. And so you could see how he would conclude. We have at least one major example of expanding the franchise and of people taking the hard money, anti-central bank, low tax position. And this continued into the late 19th century. It continued with Cleveland, who won, people forget, Cleveland won the popular vote 3 times in a row. And even though he lost the presidency in his middle race. And people forget that. They forget that the pro-gold position was very popular. The low tax position was very popular. The local control position was very popular. And this is not some alien idea. We hear a lot of modern day conservatives and libertarians claim, oh yeah, laissez-faire has never been popular. It's never been a mass movement. Bannon, right? Steve Bannon says things like, oh, that sort of thing's never been popular except among a tiny number of overeducated libertarian intellectuals. Of course, this is a completely false statement. The laissez-faire position has been very popular in different historical times and places, and not just in the U.S., but also in much of the Anglo world, and even in France, where it never really gained a majority, but was a significant part of the political milieu there. And so this is a thing that existed and which Rothbard found to be very delightful in many ways. He has an essay in the Progressive Era called The Democratic Triumph of 1892, which really looks at just how much the Democrats managed to push this laissez-faire position. Unfortunately, a lot of those unraveled with the panic of 1893 that cut a lot of Cleveland's power at that time. But he has noted in the past, Rothbard does in speeches and essays, that laissez-faire liberalism has been a popular movement and has been very popular. And so to just assume that the voters would always necessarily reject laissez-faire is not historically accurate. A lot of it probably depends on the ideology and what people learn in school. And since everyone now learns in school that socialism is the better ideology, we shouldn't be surprised that a lot of voters happen to agree with that view. But we see, I think, maybe continuing today, some elements of that in a lot of modern politics. The question is, can it ever progress to the point where it's a very popular system again within the U.S. and could maybe actually start to really win some elections as a laissez-faire party. That's an open question and something that would require a longer-term view. But have you seen any signs of resurgence, or at least what's the coalition that still somewhat keeps this torch alive?
A lot of Ron Paul's success was, I think, built on this sort of populist approach to libertarian politics, in particular on the Fed issue. Because populism at its core is, elites are screwing over the working class guy. And, typically the prescription by a lot, you can very often see populism be used as a way of giving away, tearing down big companies and giving away the state treasury to the people, whatever. But, Ron Paul, his argument was that, look, these central bankers are screwing us over. Inflation is a sinister tax. And the best way of protecting our savings is to abolish the Fed and return to sound money. And there's a wonderful, when you can tap into obvious frustrations that exist, that there's something there, that emotional appeal is, it works in a way that, if you're not going to get someone to read Human Action, if you can simply convince them that, look, it's the state that is the gang of thieves writ large, that they're the ones plundering the countryside, and so we need to step up and stop them. That is a very powerful emotional play, and so when Rothbard, for example, in the 90s, when he's evaluating the coalition with Pat Buchanan and things like this, he's looking, for his article, A Strategy for the Right, is one of my favorite political essays of his. And then he starts talking about the New Deal and all of that. But what's interesting is that 90s politics became very relevant again within kind of the Trump era, because there's Trump in many ways was kind of a Buchanan-like figure. And leading up to that, the Tea Party itself was a very populist movement, right? Hey, look, these people are spending everything away. Obamacare is a massive socialist takeover of medicine. So some of the claims might have, and unfortunately the Tea Party was a complete failure, because once you elected a new group of Republican officials, they very quickly became in the pocket of the establishment. John Boehner and Paul Ryan, were being portrayed as revolutionary figures. Paul Ryan in particular was being sold as, this is a wonder kid that's going to solve the Tea Party's problems, and not quite work out. But again, that was another example in recent history of this growing, hey, government screwing us over. And again, I think that is directly kind of fueled a lot of the Trump rise currently. And obviously, Trump is not a libertarian by any means. There's plenty of anti-laissez-faire economic policy that he has promoted. But the idea of, hey, you have certain progressively entrenched powers, again, things like the corporate press, things like, what we're seeing in higher education, things like, DC experts and these very same entrenched interests that we were talking about earlier. If you see Trump as a middle finger to that, then it's precisely the fact that you have this resentment to these elites that I think you have some people that are willing to overlook some of the libertarian blemishes on the very anti-libertarian policies, because they're so emotionally invested on sticking it to these people. And so if libertarians, that's what Rothbard was trying to highlight, is that if libertarians can capture on that emotional appeal, then that's a political strategy within a democratic system that could be very powerful. And in fact, I think one of the things that he's trying to Mises himself, when he talks about the marketplace and he talks about mass consumption and all sorts of, he makes a point that, mass consumed goods, you're going to get a lot of trashy detective novels and things like that. You're not going to get the finer things. In politics, but it appeals to the masses. Well, in politics, unlike the market, you only get one good at the end, right? There's a sole winner in an election. So within that, you have to be able to package your ideology. You have to be able to package your message in a way that appeals to the masses as much as possible. And so that emotional appeal of, hey, look, these are the people that are screwing us over. We've got the answers to fix this. We want to restore merit. rather than nepotism and privilege. That is something that I think is a very powerful message for those advocating laissez-faire.
Yes, building on your comment about how you have to package things, right? So much of American electoral history is about the parties forming these coalitions that they hope will lead to some sort of enduring victory election after election. And of course, that changes over time as ideologies change, as the economic and political realities in different states change, as the regions change. And we can see this then in Rothbard's discussion of the Cleveland Democrats and of the third party system. Now, for non-political scientists, the United States has gone through a variety of party systems. And this is a system that is based upon how did the different interest groups align within the two parties? And then how successful was each party at gaining essentially the electoral votes from each state over that time period. And the U.S. is currently allegedly in the sixth party system. And in Cleveland's time, it was in the third party system. But a big change, the end of laissez-faire as a dominant force essentially ended with the end of the third party system. And so Cleveland was the final days of that. And then the Democratic Party moved away from laissez-faire as it embraced free coinage of silver, and it was taken over by a different sort of populist, that run by William Jennings Bryan, who of course went on to lose the election in 1896. But he essentially turned the Democratic Party away from what had long been its good, solid, hard money position, which also meant that the Democratic Party was the good, low-spending fiscal responsibility party, which had been popular for a long time. But after that, then, the Republican Party started to realign itself. It realized that the whole prohibitionist thing, the moralism, the pietistic stuff of talking down to all of the new immigrants and the German Catholics and the Catholics in general as for their wrong religion and their immoral behavior. And it was very much, the Republicans used to talk to Americans very much the way Democrats talk to Americans now. It's they might have called new immigrants and Catholics and rural farmers deplorables back in 1892 if they thought of it. But they realized that wasn't a winning thing. So they started then promising all of these groups, oh, well, actually, the tariff benefits you, so we'll raise the tariff and it'll help working men. Before then, the working men didn't fall for it. They recognized that the tariff only helped people who worked in those specific protected industries, and they knew that the tariff actually ended up hurting most people, especially small business owners, which back then was a very large percentage of the population. But the Republicans figured out, well, we can kind of triangulate around the Democrats and we'll abandon the whole moralistic stuff and we'll promise protectionism as a means of getting rich and free coinage, fine, whatever. We'll have a lot of big spending and we'll help you out and we'll throw fiscal responsibility out the window and inflationism. Look, it works for you. That's fine. And that actually worked for the Republicans in the fourth party system right up until the Great Depression. And so the question is what's the alignment now? I'm starting to think that maybe we're on the cusp of a new party system forming. The old coalition maybe is breaking down because of Trumpism, which I don't think Trumpism's going away, even if Trump goes away. And there could be some new system coming out of this. What do you think?
There's so much up in the air in terms of party leadership, I think, in the near future. I mean, Joe Biden is, and on the Democratic side, the election of Joe Biden was a kind of a pushback towards the energy that you saw from like the genuine left, the proudly democratic socialist left in America trying to take over the Democratic Party. But again, I mean, Joe Biden, even if Joe Biden ends up winning this election, I mean, he is not the future of the Democratic Party. No matter how much, I know that there's a lot of, you have a lot of former Bush people and the Lincoln Project trying to, looking at potentially having a role there in the future. I'm not sure that's really going to play out considering where the energy of the party is. On the Republican side, if Trump wins, then I think that's definitely a strong stamp. There's no way the Republican Party is ever going to, I think, see a true kind of Bush revival there. Whereas if it's a landslide, humiliating defeat, you're going to have a lot of the old school establishment take the reins and play, I told you so, in spite of the fact that their record of inadequacy prior to Trump. And the other thing is that, Trump really isn't, for all of his rhetoric, there's not much ideological meat there. Within the Trump orbit, you've had various different sort of coalitions kind of playing against each other. And so that has its own sort of it's going to be difficult to see who ends up winning those intertribal battles there. If you're looking at larger trends, though, I think one of the things that's been very interesting, there was a study that came out a couple of years ago called the Hidden Tribes of America that kind of looked at issues like political correctness, looked at kind of how people, beyond kind of a pure, what are your opinions on tax policy and things like that, kind of kind of cultural trends and various different demographics. And so, one of the big concerns that you've gotten from the really nativist right, has been oh, well, increasing Hispanic populations is going to significantly move America to the left. And this is why, they've used that as one of the go-to justifications for restricting immigration control, restricting immigration. Well, if you look at some of the cultural the biggest, the most liberal leftist coalition within America are white college-educated voters. And particularly, the more college education you have, those postgraduate degrees, that trends to the left and sometimes the very far left. And that kind of plays into some of the urban versus rural divides, right, that we've seen play out. When we had the gun protests in Virginia, I looked into, I wrote an article about how, what we're seeing in Virginia is going to playing out in other states. Because one of the things that's completely changed Virginia from being one of the reddest areas of the country to being, I think now effectively, it's not a purple state anymore; it's a solid blue state. Virginia is one of the growth of college degrees and postgraduate degrees. Virginia is one of the leading states in the growth there in the last 20 years, and I think those part of that has to do with the economy in North Virginia and its connection to DC and all that. But I think that that's had a major impact there. And so I think that what you could end up seeing is a right that is defined perhaps less by doctrinaire, traditional conservative policy views as much as that this kind of Trumpian anti-political correctness, making fun of the Latinx sort of designation from the left. The more of these cultural issues pushing back towards of kind of a reaction towards the aggressive nature of kind of this progressive leftism of modern universities. And even though that Trump's only has really been a 4-year term here, the changing in voter behavior is quite significant. You've seen, the blue-collar union hall workers, moved from being historically Democratic voters to being Republican voters. This was the major narrative that changed the Rust Belt in 2016. When you look at people that, even those that think that Trump is very far behind in Rust Belt states, one of the measures they look for in terms of his performance is, what is the voter turnout look like in, again, these historically blue-collar areas. They look at the divide between non-college educated versus college-educated white voters and some of the differences there. And again, what's really, really fascinating is that what's playing out right now is the change in just 4 years of the Hispanic vote in a surprise, strong Trump showing. Ron DeSantis in Florida, for example, 2018, the Republican Party had tremendous success because of Cuban voters turning out in a big way. That's playing over with Trump now. There's a New York Times poll this week that showed Trump winning with Hispanic male voters. I don't think that this is a direct result of any major new change in policy per se. I think it is a culturally driven sort of narrative that, if you're a very masculine, macho male, there's things that some of the left has prioritized that might be turning you off. And so that, again, like the calculation there is I think less about, a specific policy platform as much more of these kind of hidden, these underlying cultural dynamics that, again, just we're seeing the polarization of American, the difference between urban and rural really play out in a way that is completely changing your typical go-to voter in both major parties. And how that ends up continuing in a post-Trump world is going to be very interesting to watch. But it's certainly true that the hardcore bases have changed dramatically in just a very short period of time.
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned the lack of ideological content here, right? Rothbard notes that after the third party system, the party systems became pretty much non-ideological in the sense that there was a coherent ideology driving the Democrats' worldview throughout the 19th century. But that ends then with that party system where it becomes more of just a system of cobbling together coalitions that can get you to win elections. And many Americans perhaps think that this is a new thing where we talk all the time about, well, which state is in play this election, and candidate A needs to make sure and win these states, which are the in-between states, and so on. But that's always been the case. And that was, for example, the reason Cleveland lost in 1888 was New York was very much in play in that period, even though that was Cleveland's home state. And he lost it by 1% margin in 1888 and subsequently lost the election, even though he won the popular vote. And that's what you try to do as a candidate. You got to put some states in play, maybe that weren't in play before. And I think that was Trump's genius, if you want to call it that, or just his good luck, perhaps, in 2016, was putting the old Rust Belt, the upper Midwest in play in a way that nobody thought would happen. Wisconsin, Michigan, and so on. Everyone assumed the South would go to him and so on. But those states, Pennsylvania as well, he actually managed to win those. And that's just the typical example of what you need to do in a presidential election. You got to hammer out some states that were maybe unexpected, turn the purple states. The purple states have always existed. New York was a purple state in 1888, right? And so they've managed to hammer that out now in a certain way, but what's the ideological content there? And that's what I'm looking at right now. As you note, right, there's definitely a culture war element to the Trump coalition. The question is, does that translate into actual policy, right? Obviously, Trump isn't the anti-tariff guy, but maybe he is the overall low tax guy. Obviously, the tax equation is very different now than it was in the 1880s because they didn't have an income tax then. And so maybe you can be pro-tariff but still be the low federal tax guy. And maybe that is a big element then of the Trump coalition. But what about on some of these other issues? I mean, obviously, Trump isn't the anti-central bank candidate. How does that translate into policy? So, yeah, it seems like there's a lot of impressions, a lot of emotional elements to the coalition, but it's unclear over time if that will translate into specific policy prescriptions beyond just simply not letting tax rates go up or maybe some level of deregulation. What about some of those larger issues that existed? I don't know. It's still so unclear how that might happen. But yeah, so much of it's just going to come down to which states can we get to vote in the majority of this particular coalition. And if things really do dramatically change, then yeah, maybe we are entering then a seventh party system. I don't know how that's going to turn out, but it does seem that things are a little bit different with this whole issue around the white working class. And not even just the Anglo working class, Anglo-white, because as you mentioned, right, Hispanics are an important factor here, and not just Cuban Hispanics, right? We've long known that they're different, that they're more conservative because of their, in many cases, refugees from Cuba, and they're very anti-communist and so on. But I come from the Mexican type of Hispanic out in the Southwest, and that's half my family. And talking to my mother's side about that, there's not a whole lot of support for these graduate, educated Anglo-Saxons that are constantly talking down to us and telling us about how we should use the word Latinx now, which, of course, 99.9% of Mexican Americans think is idiotic. And so that whole issue there perhaps is creating a rift. And I've said in columns in the past that today's Hispanic Americans are really just the white Americans of the future, right? Like we used to refer to Italians as basically just subhuman in this country. And now they're considered part of the oppressor class. And I think Hispanics are going in that direction also, in spite of what some anti-immigrant conservatives may think, which is why you probably should stop trash-talking Hispanics if you want to actually build a working coalition in the future. But so much is up in the air. But I think Rothbard was right in that the libertarian side, or rather the populist side of the right, was always the most interesting part. And this kind of brings us to the last issue here, is the conservative movement in general always had this populist issue. This was the anti-New Deal. This was the part of that coalition that opposed the limousine liberal, we used to call them, and which have pretty much taken over the party now as they've abandoned the union part of the party. And I suppose maybe we called them the Reagan Democrats in the 80s. This was really the leave me alone, I love America, sort of culturally conservative part of the party, which was very distinct from the Buckleyite wing of the party, which was very much this Ivy League, we're too refined and too civilized to engage in any sort of this populist stuff. And I noticed you had tweeted about that, saying that maybe the right has moved away from the Buckleyite side of things and more into the gun-toting populist side of things. And what do you think the effect will be of that? Do you think that the populist wing of that coalition will become more important over time?
Within the conservative movement, there was this great fracture because of the trumpeting, right? I mean, the National Review's against Trump, purple issue, and because kind of like the last gasp of the last big Buckley era pushback against the Trump phenomenon, and it was a total disaster. And you still have few kind of holders on. You get the Lincoln Project. I think they're kind of a particularly kind of unique of just political hacks, trying to get a whole bunch of money from very motivated Democratic donors, and so they kind of a different game. But you still have like the Jonah Goldbergs and you have others that they still think that Trump's style is it's the aesthetic itself is against the conservatism that they claim to believe, and the problem is the conservatism they claim to believe in never really worked. The national Buckley's project, I mean, for the most part, it succeeded to the extent that it pushed a lot of people like Murray Rothbard, like Paul Gottfried, out of the establishment conservative intellectual class, and kind of created, was great at protecting their own turf. But in terms of a political movement, it was, that was the conservatism that was dying out now. That had given us the Mitt Romneys of the world. And I think it's changing with, Trump owning the libs, because at least he's winning, right? That's the whole thing. It's like, his style might not be great, but here he actually, it's absolutely incredible that, Trump's legislative victories for the conservative movement, three Supreme Court justices, massive deregulation, got the tax thing through, abortion advocate, anti-abortion advocate, he was out there at March of Life events in ways that no other president, Republican president ever had been. How much of this stuff, like Trump, is Trump really motivated by constitutional originalism? I don't think so. But he recognized that, hey, here's the base of the people that put him in office. He's delivering for them, and it's worked. And I think that going forward, being able to not try to intellectually engage with opponents that aren't interested in a real conversation. That's I think one of the big ramifications here, because instead of trying to win over, we're gonna win an intellectual battle with the New York Times opinion page. No, like we're gonna create our new outlets. We're gonna create different institutions, because trying to win the respect of a certain cocktail party crowds is not going to work out for us. It's always been a losing battle, and so I think that Buckleyite's the Buckleyite slogan, the mantra of American conservatism, standing history, yelling stop when no one else will. Simply yelling stop it didn't work. Meanwhile, if you have people like McCloskey's willing to take up arms and to pretend to defend their property rights when people are infringing upon it, that is a much more effective message. And I think that's the right accepting that the political norms that recognizing the breakdown of political norms and willing to play the game appropriately. That it was an important step forward for right and wrong, because there's plenty of policy prescriptions there that are very not libertarian in nature, and that's why I think libertarians also there's a lot here for us to gain and learn from as well, so that we can have success in the future. But being able to actually add a little bit of teeth and not play a losing and rigged game is I think one of the important lessons for this Trump era. And I think that again, when we polarization of America is one of the constant themes, and I think that's something that we're all recognizing. When you start having both sides build up their own institutions rather than compete for the same ones, I think that this just keeps kind of lending itself to this larger sense of disunity that trying to crack down and impose, pushing things back into an order of like a unified order is going to, is as it exists now is not going to work out well. Like I think that this is a natural byproduct of just very severe fundamental disagreements in underlying sense of morality and ethics and worldviews that cannot be reconciled by union. They can only be reconciled. They are better left alone and able to stand alone. And again, the more that the political right recognizes that this is not a conversation that can be won. It's not an intellectual debate can be won. It's better to simply stop caring about the opinions of the New York Times, of the Democrats, of whatever. The better off that any political ideology is going to win when you start recognizing the world as it is. And I think that the ramifications that has on the American project, as it continues to play out, will be very interesting.
Well, I think it would be altogether suitable to finish this discussion on that note of pro-secessionism and really wrap things up until the election is over and we know what's going on, and we can return to some of those issues and see if things are working out for the Trump coalition or what we think things will look like from 2024 going forward. But this will be our last one before Election Day, and we'll be back afterward probably to have a look at what happened on Tuesday. But until then, thank you very much for listening to Radio Rothbard. Have a wonderful week.